Welcome to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. Do you wonder how your faith fits together with your profession? Well, join us as we explore how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Well, hello and welcome to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. My name is Dr. Barry Schwenk. I'm a veterinarian, a pastor, and your host as we explore the intersection of faith and veterinary medicine. Well-being is a challenge for all of us within the veterinary profession. And actually, to be honest, even if you're not in the veterinary profession, well-being is a challenge. Trying to constantly be in the act of balancing all these different aspects of our lives. And we have been talking with Dr. Rob Goodman and exploring the 5 spheres of well-being. We've talked about physical well-being and emotional well-being, and last week we started our conversation on relational well-being. So Dr. Rob, it's great to have you back again. I appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule. How are things going for you today?
Oh, very well. It's good to be back talking with you and talking around this topic of relational well-being. You know, we mentioned last time that I think you mentioned the creation story of, you know, things were not good when man was alone, and we are created in order to image God in relationship. And Jesus summarizes it by looking at our relationships with God, self, and others, and characterizing those all as love. To love God with all that we are, to love our neighbor in the same manner as we love ourselves. And so this relational sphere, you know, I think every time I talk about one of the spheres of well-being, it's the most important one. Kind of like my favorite book of the Bible is the one that I'm reading.
That's exactly.
My favorite verse is the one I'm preaching on. But I think this is such a central part of being human. And oftentimes we look at our self-care as being selfish. But part of that is, one, being able to know how to love ourselves so we can love others, but also stepping into what we are actually created for, as to be loving creatures to one another.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's as we were talking about, and same thing. Every time we get ready to talk, I'm like, oh, this is the one I'm most interested in hearing about, and then the next one it'll be exactly the same way. But this, you know, relational well-being is so vitally important, and within the veterinary profession, we have struggled. I mean, we've struggled with this for so long. I remember thinking back to that time, even when contemplating going into veterinary medicine, the first thing they talk to you about is the high divorce rate and suicide rate among veterinarians, and yet we all just kind of run headlong into that without even giving a second thought to how do I prevent that from happening. And so relational well-being is such a crucial part of who we are, and one of the parts that historically we just really are not very good at, and we need to talk more about it. So last week you talked we talked together about cultivating relationships. How hard is that, do you think, from a professional standpoint within the sphere of veterinary medicine? How hard do you think that is for us to actually develop new relationships that are not simply transactional, but actually are contemplative of the person that we're interacting with?
Oh, wow. You know, you mentioned as we come into this profession, you know, I know that at least one of us on this phone call entered veterinary medicine because we loved medicine, but didn't like the people.
Yeah.
I know one of us did. I'm not going to mention
Well,
anything about you.
We'll leave that up to the listeners to decide.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily the difficulty in terms of, is it hard to do these little things? None of them are really that difficult. To be interested in someone, to listen, to understand rather than to listen to respond, to create a little space, to be in relationship, to ask questions rather than give advice.
Mm,
none of those are really that hard in and of themselves,
mm,
but it's the discipline of actually doing it
mm.
that's difficult. Yet working out 30 minutes a day isn't that hard.
Right.
But it's actually doing it that is the challenge. And so the same way with relationships, I actually heard an interesting comment from someone who was talking about, um, I've inherited the operation of the family ranch, and so I've been listening to most of my podcast consumption is on ranching and that, like, just that's my learning edge right now. And someone was talking about the succession plan of this ranch, and he
Mm,
said, with my father-in-law, I used to think that I could get by investing 2 hours a week in relationship, but
mm,
I've come to realize that I need to invest 8 hours a week into
mm.
relationship.
Yeah.
And I mean, the intentionality of planning for relationship and seeing it as an investment,
Right.
that is such a, I mean, how often, if I look at my calendar, how often do I schedule time with wife,
Right.
time with kids, time with mom, time with, friends into my schedule? I schedule meetings, I schedule tasks, I schedule all this, but that investment to relationship is a difficult piece to schedule.
It's those moments of pause in relationship. And we talked about that, I think, last time. Um, changing your pace. We get moving so fast, and we start creating this list of all these things that I've done for the people that I love. And actually just changing the pace and actually just being present for a moment also has such huge, capacity, and has such huge value. And one of the things that I think that damages veterinary relationships so much is the fact that we get so busy doing things that we lose the ability to just spend time and be present. So I wanted to talk to you about that a little bit today, because last time we talked about cultivating relationships and talked about loving people. But now, how do we? For many of us, we're in situations where there are broken relationships. So how do we then, in that moment of brokenness, because this is like changing the tire while the car is moving, how do we start to repair those relationships so that they are God-centered and exhibit that kind of godly love that we're supposed to have?
I think, again, posture begins with
Mm,
the key. Am I interested in this relationship or not? And to be honest with that, there are some relationships that are damaged that I'm really happy for them to just be damaged.
mm,
And instead of approaching that person and damaging more, that's one of those that I need to pray about until my heart changes.
mm, mm.
And even in the Psalms, we see that the Psalms of imprecation. Um, and if you want to have a great fifth grade insult book, Psalm 109 takes the cake. May your wife be a widow, may your children be orphans, and may no one give them bread when they beg in the street. I
Mhm.
mean, I can't top that. But it's often how I feel.
Right.
And so the idea and the invitation of the Psalms is to bring that before God rather than spewing that out with someone else that I can co-opt into being against this person that I feel is against me.
Mm,
But if I bring it before God, and particularly, I think the Psalms of imprecation are one of those that, to read them when we're not angry with someone,
mm.
just reinforces this discordance of, I don't like that feeling.
Right. It feels, yeah, it feels.
And I don't like feeling that way
Mhm,
in before God.
mm,
I mean, God accepts that from us. I mean, that's the part of the Psalms. But wow, when I'm not feeling that way and I hear that, it's just so discordant with how I want to be.
mm,
That trains us to have that posture of, wow, in this broken relationship, as much as I want to be right and
mm,
be vindicated, and for them to suffer for having hurt me, possibly in response to me hurting them.
mm,
All of that, as we bring those things before God, we're changed. I remember a time, yeah, very, very early in, one of those. I think our faith journey kind of comes along a space, and then there are these spikes in growth. Kind of like watching your teenagers grow. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
did you just grow 2 inches
Right.
overnight?
Exactly.
We have these growth spurts in our spiritual formation as well, and it was in one of these growth spurts, and and it was of course with the church secretary,
Mm.
um, before I was in pastoral ministry, and I was on the church leadership team, and so an email had come out that was a little bit that I read as a little bit snarky,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
and I really wanted to respond
Mm-hmm.
as the army officer, not as the caring veterinarian, nor in the pastoral way.
Yes.
And yet I knew that wasn't right, and
Right.
I couldn't figure out. So this was back before my knees and my back meant I couldn't run. So it was quite a while ago, and so I ran, and then that didn't quite do it, and I walked, and I'm praying,
Mm.
God, this just made me so mad,
Mm.
and this image came, and it is Jesus on the cross, and this
Mm.
response of, I died for her too.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
like, oh man,
Mm.
this whole repairing relationships thing is difficult, but it is so essential that's regardless of how we look at the theology of the cross, ultimately the theology of the cross restores our right relationship with God.
Right.
And I mean and it doesn't come without a cost.
Right.
And
Mm.
so, just recognizing, wow, this is a cost,
Mm.
but it's also a calling.
Yeah. I mean, that's when Paul says, therefore we are to have that same attitude as Christ, who did not consider his equality with God something to be clung to, but rather, submitted himself. When we think about relationship and we think about loving the way that Christ loved us, we have to go back to that thinking, yes, Jesus was justified in his divinity, and yet he presented himself in humanity, humbled himself, and submitted himself. And if we even in the brokenness of our relationships, more often than not, we just want to be right. We don't want the relationship to be right. We want to be right, and it creates this it creates this conflict between us, and there's no way to get beyond that. So then how do we then with that attitude of humility, how do we then begin to insert love into those broken relationships so that we can begin to repair them?
I think it's easier to look at things when they're clean,
Mm.
um, recognizing that oftentimes things are messy in relationships. But if we look at, wow, there are times when someone else has hurt me
Mm.
that's damaged relationship, and there are times when I have hurt someone else, and oftentimes those are mutual. But if we simply look at the times when someone has hurt me, and sometimes it is that we are truly innocent in that, um, in terms of when someone else takes out their hurt upon us. If we think about even in the clinic setting, your receptionist
Mm.
deals with a whole lot of hurt that she didn't cause, he or she did
Right.
not cause.
Yeah.
And this adage that hurt people.
Right.
And if we can recognize, wow, sometimes it's not about us,
Mm.
it's about the hurt of the other person.
Mm.
And I always go back to Proverbs, and Solomon in his wisdom writes, don't answer a fool according to his foolishness, lest he be justified in his own eyes, but
Right.
answer a fool as his foolishness deserves.
Mm.
Or no, don't answer a fool according to his foolishness, lest he be like you,
Right.
or lest you be like him.
Mhm.
And then, but answer as it deserves, lest he be justified in his own eyes.
Mm.
And so, if we think about that with hurt people,
Mm.
don't answer the hurt according to their hurt, or you'll be like them. I mean, our basic tendency is to respond. Someone's being hurtful, I'm going to be hurtful back and escalate that. But if we can stop and just recognize, wow, this person's hurtfulness isn't really about me.
Mm.
It's about often their grief about the the patient that they brought in. It may be about a relational conflict that they're in somewhere else, but I just happen to be the target.
Right.
And if I can recognize that this is a hurt person as well as a hurtful person,
Mm.
and instead of offering hurtfulness back, to offer healing. And again, that's a huge posture shift that requires a little bit of intentionality, or a whole lot of intentionality and a little bit of rehearsal,
Right.
to be able to say, wow, when someone spews at me, how am I going to respond with something that is both authentic to me and well received in that person? To say, wow, I hear in your voice that you're very frustrated. Can we take a step and see where your frustration is? And then, one that shifts it from our relational to where it really is. But it also offers a degree of understanding, a feeler of love out there. And it's different. It's very different saying, I can hear in your voice, or in your voice, it sounds like you are, than I understand that you are.
Right.
Because once we begin a sentence with I understand in a heated conversation, no, you don't, is the first thing that comes back, and people stop listening after that. And so, again, taking some time to structure that response so that we can respond to the hurt in other people as their hurt deserves, with healing.
Right. Well, and some of that is, there's two aspects to that, because like you mentioned, when someone begins to hurt us, that wall of defense goes up, and we want to hurt them equally. So there's a stalemate, so that they receive what we've received, just the old eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and how dare you talk to me like that? I'm going to talk to you like that. And yet, a modicum of empathy can go a long way, because in our minds, all that we see is, we see the attack, and we've created a story behind that, right? Well, why? How dare they yell at me? Don't they know that I'm trying to help them? Don't they know that my hands are tied? Don't they know? Well, maybe they don't. Maybe they are responding out of the emotion and the hurt that they've experienced, and maybe the things that you're saying and doing are actually contributing to that. So you have to, one, I think, kind of own your portion to that interaction, but then also, walking a mile in someone else's shoes goes a long way, and empathizing with where they are, and actually asking the questions, going back to, before, those open-ended questions that we talked about, asking the kinds of questions that may show someone that you're genuinely concerned about repairing, and not just inflicting more damage.
Yeah. I think also recognizing where we are in that
Mm.
process, and where our frustration is, and how we might tend to be hurtful to others when it's not really on them.
Mm.
I remember a time I was working in an organization, and we were making some massive changes organizationally, and we put out the instructions of how to. It was around the payroll system, so we had a,
So
a huge
everyone's
number of
happy.
employees
Everyone's happy then, right?
changing how they submit payroll.
Yeah.
And it's different, and nobody liked the transition anyway. Why do we need to change? And my personnel guy had put out this great step-by-step list, and there was one portion that everybody got hung up on, and it was truly because they weren't reading the directions.
Right. All right.
And so I'm sitting there at a cubicle over, and I'm listening to him, and he's saying, okay, now if you'll read step 3, it says this, and he'd walk them exactly through what was there, and he did it with such calm. And I'd heard him do this like 20 times in the last 2 hours. And
Right.
I walk over and I say, hey man, how are you doing this? This is the 20th time that I've heard you answer the same question. He goes, it was the first time for that person.
Oh, wow, that's good.
And
Yeah.
for me, that was a shock of humility. We
Mm,
talked about approaching with humility earlier. That yes, there are things that seem so obvious to us
mm,
that we answer from multiple different people every day. The clinic on the 3rd of July. Can I get tranquilizers for my dog for fireworks? That we've
right.
heard the question over and over, and it's very easy to snap at that person because you've already answered it,
Mm,
but not to that person.
yeah.
And so simply recognizing, wow, where we are in this relationship personally, and what our propensity may be, and perhaps having to take a little break and remember, okay, this is a different person.
Right. Yeah, that's that. Wow, that hit me really hard. That was the first time for them, because again, we all have these experiences and these backstories, and we come into a relationship um, expecting the other person to be a mind reader and know all this stuff that's built up behind us that's led us to this point. Um, and they have exactly the same thing, and we make assumptions about them based on our backstory. They make assumptions about us based on their backstory, and what we end up having is just this conflict and this brokenness. And if we would pause long enough, and it could be that in many of our broken relationships, that's all that it takes, is for us to pause, change the pace a little bit, change our attitude, to one of humility, and try to actually understand the other person's perspective. There's also, I think, there's got to be a modicum of forgiveness and mercy that comes in also. Um, where do you think that fits into that process of repair?
The Kairos group did a lot of work in reconciliation in some of the African nations that were disturbed by civil war
Mm,
and by genocidal activity,
mm,
and looking at what is this process of reconciliation. And the big part of that, and of course, again, it's really easy when it's clean,
right,
um, that this person murdered my family, um, relatively unprovoked, other than
right.
my tribe or my ethnicity. There is a very clear perpetrator and victim in that cleans things up, and it's always a little bit more messy for us. But what they found was that reconciliation is possible in this prayerful setting, where the person who has been wronged is able to share their story
Mm,
of hurt, and the person who has wronged them is able to hear that story and basically own the hurt that they've caused, and then to ask for forgiveness.
mm,
And then the person who is hurt, who has been hurt, has the choice to choose their own hurt or to choose forgiveness.
mm,
And whether they value relationship over their own hurt is whether reconciliation occurs or not.
mm.
And so that idea of, wow, the person who is feeling wronged has to be able to share their story, and the person who has done the hurting has to be able to hear that story and acknowledge, not not to say, well, I did that because,
Right.
but to acknowledge, yes, in my actions I caused you hurt, and I am truly sorry for that. And then both have to choose whether the relationship is more important than the damage that has been done. And that's not easy. I mean,
Right.
with it took a cross to do that.
Right.
um and that's the type of self-sacrifice, really, on both sides of that.
Mm,
um I have to sacrifice, if I have wronged you, and I have heard the ways that I've wronged you. I have to crucify my own desire for self-justification,
right.
and there are reasons that I did that, and I think they're good.
Mm,
I have to crucify those. If if you have hurt me, I have to crucify my own desire for vengeance,
Mm,
my cultivation of that hurt is part of who I am.
mm,
And and so neither one of those are easy.
mm,
But that is the way of reconciliation, the way that we are called to be reconciled one to another.
mm,
I mean, I think about that church in Damascus
mm.
as as Saul who became Paul comes in, and I mean he's on the road
Right.
to lead them back to Jerusalem in chains, and they
Right.
know this.
Right.
And Ananias says, "Hey, come meet my new friend Paul."
That's right.
Yeah. I imagine what move the Holy Spirit that took,
Right.
for Paul to be welcomed and to teach there.
Mm. Well, it seems like the greatest stumbling block between hurt and relationship, oftentimes with in that brokenness, is our own sense of justice, right? The what has occurred, there needs to be justice, and trying to balance that idea of mercy and justice together can really impede that process, I would think.
And I think that that's true one to another, but it's even more true as we get into an organization.
Mm, hmm.
Of balancing, if we have two employees and one has messed up, however that may be, and the other one hasn't, how do we extend mercy to the one who has messed up, but also be just to the one who hasn't? Um, and I think that balancing personal mercy and organizational justice is a difficult balance, and I don't have good tools for that other than that's a good way to pray. um how do I do this? Because and I always go back to the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit from Isaiah. Give
Mm,
me knowledge, wisdom, and understanding,
mm,
godly counsel, holy strength, and the the awareness of the awesomeness of the power of God, and the intimate love of God. And so that balancing of the the awesomeness of God in the best use of that word, the overwhelmingness of the presence of God, that Isaiah says, "I'm going to die," and Peter says, "Go away from me, I'm not worthy." That feeling with also the intimate love of God that draws us to him. I think that's that tension between justice and mercy, that that's the image of God that we cultivate in ourselves to hold that together.
Well, you put all that into you put that all very well. The actual where the rubber hits the road. This one's the challenging one, right? This is the one where, um, eh, and especially when as you start to get other people involved, and the messiness and the complexity of relationships, and whether those are relationships that are founded in Christ, those are mutual believer. I mean, all the complexity of all of that can certainly disrupt our act of balancing and can certainly disrupt our well-being. And I think um, you really just have to be willing to approach this with humility, but also I think that your level of communication with the people that you're working with is also critically important.
And that look at, wow, how do I communicate things with everybody and respect the confidentiality of one person?
Right.
And I think that begins with the conversation with the one person of, hey, I know this is difficult. I know that there are things that you want to keep private. This is what I would like to share. Would that be okay with you? And to line that out early, rather than letting it slip out, and or to make assumptions.
Mm,
We started with our posture looking at, wow, what are my assumptions?
right.
And now, wow, and how rarely we test and verify those assumptions of thinking about what the other person feels. That really open communication of, wow, what is okay to share, what is not okay to share.
Mm,
um what This is why I want to share it, to be open with with the larger group, again, in this tension of organizational justice and interpersonal mercy, to be very open about the values of your organization. We want, however you say, we want to pursue organizational justice and interpersonal mercy. And I want you to trust me well enough to know that there are consequences, there are organizational consequences to misbehavior, but there are also interpersonal healing that is possible, and we walk in that. And so those types of communication, and that's a place where you can, again, begin to have some structures that you're able to, if you've thought about this, you can have some structuring and some messaging that starts long beforehand about what our values are, what the norms of our team are, and to be able to do that, again, learning to dance before the night of the prom is always a better thing.
Always a better thing. Well, I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about relational well-being. I think for many folks listening here, many of you are probably going through that process of trying to move from hurt to relationship. And it begins with having that same attitude of Christ and approaching relationship with humility, also learning how to grow in the love and forgiveness of Christ, because as we're able to love and forgive only because we have understood more clearly his love and forgiveness towards us. It's certainly not an easy process to be continually in this act of balancing, especially when it comes to interpersonal relationships. And so our prayer for you here at CVM, from Dr. Rob, from myself, our prayer is that as you learn to abide in him, as you prayerfully consider the relationships around you, that he would lead you into godly places with those relationships, giving you the opportunity to be the light and salt that he has called you to be. And as you learn how to do that, together, we are learning how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Thank you for listening to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. If you are blessed by this content, like and subscribe so that you are alerted when new content is released. If you would like more information about CVM, or if you have questions, comments, or topical suggestions, you can find us online at www.cvm.org. Or you can contact us by emailing podcast@cvm.org. God has a plan for the nations, and that plan includes you. We pray that CVM has encouraged you to live out your calling with confidence and competence. So, until next time, may the voice of the shepherd ring loud and clear as you follow him in faith to the intersection of two roads crossing.